Welcome to the channel where we lift the shiny veil of cities that appear perfect and expose the truths that few dare to face. Today, our journey stops in Alabama, the heart of the American South, a land famous for its proud historical legacy, for blues music echoing from old porches, for fiery football, and for traditional Southern hospitality. But just step outside those dazzling frames, and another Alabama appears, a place where thousands of people struggle to survive on the margins of the road, without a roof over their heads, without a secure future. According to 2024 estimates, there are more than 4,000 homeless people across the state, and the situation has become even more suffocating after devastating hurricanes and tornadoes, along with successive economic shocks. So then, with millions of dollars in budget already poured in, why does the problem remain increasingly out of control? What is being hidden behind the promising reports? Today's film will not only take you into the center of this crisis, but will also uncover shocking truths that shake the image of an Alabama that once seemed peaceful and prosperous. Alabama, often proudly called the heart of the South, has long been associated with images of blues melodies echoing in old bars, the sound of jazz horns drifting down midnight streets, and college football games burning like festivals. It is also a land forever marked in history by the civil rights movement, where the call for justice once rang loudly. But when the stadium lights go dark, when the music falls silent, another Alabama emerges cold and harsh. On the sidewalks of Birmingham, beneath the overpasses in Montgomery, or along the banks of the Mobile River, thousands of people quietly spread out torn tarps and call them home. It is a heart-wrenching contrast. Right in the middle of a state proud of its history and culture, thousands of its citizens still sleep outdoors, exposed to the scorching summer sun or the freezing winter chill. The numbers speak for themselves. According to 2024 estimates, Alabama has more than 4,000 homeless people. At first glance, this figure may seem lighter compared to coastal states or America's megacities. But place it in the context of Alabama, a state with fewer than 5 million people and limited resources, and it becomes an enormous burden. Each tent camp that springs up in a park, each old truck turned into an overnight shelter, is vivid evidence of a growing imbalance. And like a wound left without a bandage, this problem continues to spread, eating away at the very roots of social stability. Behind this reality lies a web of intertwined causes, economic, natural disasters, and policies, all together forming an inescapable spiral. First is income and cost of living. Alabama still maintains the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour, the lowest in the United States. A full-time worker, after taxes, takes home only about $1,200 per month. Meanwhile, the rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Birmingham ranges from $1,000 to $1,200. This means a low-income worker must spend nearly 90% of their income just to pay rent. What remains far too little to cover food, medicine, or child-rearing costs forces many to choose between eating dinner or paying the electric bill. One unexpected shock, no matter how small, is enough to pull them into the abyss. Then come the repeated natural disasters. Alabama lies in Tornado Alley, where tornadoes and major storms are not rare events, but a destiny that repeats each year. In 2024, a violent storm swept through, destroying tens of thousands of homes, displacing tens of thousands of people. When the winds quieted, many families had no place left to return to. They suddenly became refugees in their own homeland, wandering in temporary shelters or on the streets. And when the next storm comes, wounds that never had the chance to heal are torn open once again. But perhaps the most fatal blow comes from the weak social safety net. Compared to other states, Alabama spends very little on public health, unemployment benefits, or housing subsidies. A person who loses their job here may receive only a few meager dollars in aid, not even enough to cover half a month's rent. A family with a seriously ill member but no health insurance is left in despair. The system that is supposed to be a safety net is nothing more than a torn net. Anyone who stumbles falls straight to the bottom, with no chance of climbing back up. When all of these causes are combined to wages that are far too low, housing costs beyond endurance, devastating natural disasters, and insufficient social welfare, we arrive at the explanation for Alabama's bleak picture today. A state famous for its hospitality, yet powerless in the face of thousands of its citizens forced to seek makeshift shelter beneath tattered tarps. A land once etched into history with the aspiration for justice, now struggling with a paradox. How to protect human dignity when the very roof over one's head, the most basic need, has become a luxury. If a home is the shield that protects people from wind and rain, then when that shield shatters, every other wound is free to strike. In Alabama, the homeless do not just lose a place to sleep, they lose their chance to be healthy, safe, and recognized as ordinary citizens. The streets of Birmingham at night are filled not only with the sound of traffic, but also with the harsh coughs of the elderly trembling in the cold, the groans of veterans lost in the darkness of memory, and the hollow eyes of young men caught in the spiral of addiction. One of the most serious challenges is the mental health crisis. About 1/3 of homeless people in Alabama suffer from psychological illnesses, severe depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD from war, even schizophrenia. These are not dry numbers, but heart-wrenching stories. An Iraq War veteran, after years of service, returns with nightmares that tangle his sleep, unable to find stable work, gradually abandoned by society's embrace. He wanders through parks, drifting between two worlds, a haunted past and a harsh present. Alabama, once a land that produced resilient soldiers, now stands powerless to give them a peaceful home when they return. On top of that, the underground storm of fentanyl sweeping across the American South has not spared Alabama. With just 2 milligrams, a few grains of salt of fentanyl is enough to take a life. In Birmingham, fentanyl-related deaths rose by more than 150% in only 4 years, from 2020 to 2024. And the homeless already living on the margins of society, deprived of care, are the easiest prey. A dose of fentanyl, both cheap and potent, becomes a temporary escape from inner pain, but in exchange brings death ever closer. Thus, the vicious cycle tightens. Addiction, job loss, homelessness, deeper addiction. It is not only the young or middle-aged, the elderly are also bearing the burden. Around 20% of the homeless in Alabama are over the age of 55. With an average pension of only about $900 per month from Social Security, they cannot afford even the minimum rent. Picture a woman who once worked as an office secretary, who spent her life typing and filing documents, now in her old age sleeping inside an old truck, waiting for a nursing home spot on a list that takes years. Gray heads, instead of enjoying retirement, are exposed to the wind and dew, becoming living proof of the fragility of the social safety system. More troubling still, the phenomenon of middle-class decline has been spreading. No longer confined to the familiar image of the chronically poor, the homelessness crisis in Alabama now touches groups once considered stable. A university lecturer loses teaching contracts after budget cuts, a steelworker becomes unemployed when the factory shuts down, or a bank employee drowning in credit card debt, just a few months of imbalance, and the roof over their head slips out of reach. This proves that homelessness is no longer someone else's problem, but a danger that can strike anyone. All these hardships combine into a harsh reality. The homeless in Alabama live in weakened bodies, fractured minds, and prolonged social isolation. They are looked upon with suspicion as potential criminals, instead of human beings who once had pasts, who once contributed. This very stigma pushes them further away from the community's embrace, making the path back to employment, healthcare, or a second chance at life nearly impossible. When we piece the fragments together, the picture becomes clear. Alabama is not only facing a housing crisis, but also a crisis of human dignity. Because behind every makeshift tent, every torn blanket, lies an exhausted body, a broken soul, and a society turning its back on its own citizens. In the face of a rising wave of crisis, Alabama has not stood entirely still. Federal funds, emergency relief packages, temporary policies have been delivered like life preservers. From the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development (HUD) to disaster relief funds, tens of millions of dollars have flowed into the state. Local authorities have also launched programs, expanding shelter systems, implementing localized versions of Inside Safe, building a few rehab centers and emergency care services. On paper, it looks like a chain of actions showing determination. But in reality, the picture is far more complicated and far less bright than the reports. Picture a rainy night in Birmingham. While leaky tarpaulin tents huddle in the wind, on the other side of the city a newly opened shelter is showcased on television as a lifeline for the homeless. but its capacity is only enough for a few dozen people, while thousands remain outside. The crowded folding beds cannot possibly fill the gap between actual demand and trickling resources. Public housing projects have also been initiated, but construction is too slow and costs climb higher by the day. Many projects are unfinished, stuck on paper, serving as evidence of the inability to turn ideas into reality. Another major obstacle is the recurrence of natural disasters. Each storm season, each tornado wipes out what was just built. Hundreds of families who had just settled into subsidized apartments lose everything overnight. The financial aid just sufficient to rebuild a roof is immediately swept away by the next storm. It feels like running on quicksand. The harder you try, the deeper you sink. Meanwhile, data collection and management are riddled with gaps. Homeless population counts, the foundation for policy planning, are often delayed, even inaccurate. People sleeping in trucks and parking lots, people staying temporarily with friends, or people wandering in parks, all are sometimes left uncounted. When the data is inaccurate, the policies that follow are slow and misdirected. Many experts call this a hidden crisis, because the official figures are always lower than reality, masking the true severity. The problem also lies in bureaucracy and fragmented responsibility. Federal funds flow in, but as they pass through each layer of management, each procedure, each set of paperwork, the actual money reaching direct services for the homeless dwindles significantly. Sometimes millions of dollars vanish in the whirlpool of procedures, while a bed, a hot meal, or a dose of medicine for someone outside remains unsecured. This makes many citizens lose trust, even doubt whether relief funds are truly being used for their intended purpose. Of course, there are efforts worth recognizing. Some nonprofit organizations have partnered with the government to run emergency support centers. A few churches, continuing the tradition of once leading the civil rights movement, now open their doors as temporary shelters. But all of this is only like faint sparks in the dark. Sparks just enough to keep hope from dying completely, but not enough to light the long road ahead. Looking at the whole picture, it is easy to see that Alabama is stuck in a loop. Funds exist, but management is weak. Projects exist, but progress is sluggish. Solutions exist, but are erased by natural disasters and social injustice. The truth is, policy efforts have only touched the surface of the iceberg, while the submerged part, a stagnant economy, low wages, high housing costs, weak health and social services, remains untouched. And as long as those root causes are not addressed, each new policy will only be like a temporary bandage on a festering wound. In Alabama, the paradox is stark. A state can spend millions of dollars on modern football stadiums, yet struggle to build sustainable homes for the homeless. A place once inscribed in history for major advances in social justice, now slow and fragmented in protecting the dignity of its most vulnerable. And that is precisely why, despite the efforts, Alabama's homelessness crisis remains without an escape. If the dry statistics only suggest a cold perspective, then it is the daily life of the homeless that lays bare the raw truth. In Alabama, the consequence of the crisis is not just policy reports left forgotten in drawers, but vivid, harsh images that haunt anyone who witnesses them. By day, on the streets of Birmingham, tents line the riverbanks or public parks. Beneath the thin tarps, hollow eyes gaze out at the world where others hurry to work, to school, to shop while they are left behind, invisible in the current of society. By night, old trucks, empty parking lots, or overpasses become homes for hundreds of people. No electricity, no clean water, no stable meals, only darkness and constant anxiety. Danger surrounds them on every side. According to many surveys, 1 in 3 homeless people has been assaulted or robbed. When you live in a tent without a lock, everything you own, from an old blanket to a pair of worn-out shoes, can be stolen at any moment. And when night falls, the fear of violence clings even tighter, making their sleep fragile and restless. Then there is Alabama's harsh climate, a silent enemy. In summer, temperatures can reach 40 degrees Celsius, the heat radiating from asphalt, turning nylon tents into suffocating ovens. Many suffer from exhaustion, dehydration, or even die from heat stroke. In winter, temperatures drop near freezing, with wind cutting through flesh. Those without enough warm clothing easily fall into hypothermia. Season after season, nature becomes a cruel test of endurance for those without shelter. Health deteriorates rapidly as a result, With no showers, no toilets, diseases such as pneumonia, hepatitis, seasonal flu spread through the homeless community within days. A cough left untreated can become pneumonia. A small wound without disinfectant can turn into full-body infection. Meanwhile, access to the healthcare system, already difficult for the poor, is even more unreachable for the homeless. Illness accumulates, while medical care remains out of reach. But perhaps social stigma is the heaviest burden. The homeless are often seen as potential criminals, as threats to public order. When applying for jobs, they are rejected for lacking a fixed address. When arriving at hospitals, they are met with suspicious eyes. When walking into stores, they are followed as if thieves. Every glance, every slammed door gradually pushes them further away from society. Not only do they lose homes, they also lose the feeling of being recognized as human beings. And behind the words risk, victim, social problem, and reports, the reality is painful everyday stories. A former university lecturer with 20 years at the podium now sleeps in a park buried in medical and student debt. An Iraq War veteran, carrying psychological wounds that never heal, now drifts through city streets seeking warmth from a cheap can of beer. A 70-year-old woman who spent her life in office work now lives in an old truck because nursing homes are overcrowded and her pension cannot cover rent. Each story is a fragment, pieced together into the collective tragedy of Alabama. Looking at that daily life, it is clear. The homelessness crisis is not just an economic problem, but the collapse of dignity. It erodes health, fractures the spirit, and spreads fear and shame. Each makeshift tent, each truck turned into a bed is not just a shelter, but a brutal reminder that society has failed to guarantee the most basic thing, a home for its own citizens. If the tent camps along the Montgomery River or the huddled figures beneath Birmingham's bridges are the present picture, then the big question is, how can we paint a different future? The solution to Alabama's homelessness crisis cannot stop at makeshift shelters or free meals. It demands a comprehensive reconstruction of housing, economy, healthcare, education, and community spirit. First of all, housing must be considered the center of every strategy. Without a home, all other support is like laying a blanket over a body already cold. Alabama must boldly reform zoning laws, allowing the development of more affordable housing projects right within major cities, instead of pushing them out to distant suburbs. Abandoned buildings, old industrial sites can be converted into temporary housing. At the same time, rent control mechanisms must be established to prevent landlords from evicting tenants just to raise prices. Each home built is not only four walls, but also an affirmation of human dignity. Alongside this, the economy needs a fairer adjustment. With the minimum wage at $7.25 per hour, Alabama is trapping workers in a cycle of poverty. Raising this wage to at least $12-15 per hour is essential so that workers can live without having to sacrifice all their income to rent. At the same time, increasing subsidies for low-income families would help them avoid the fragile line that leads to homelessness after a single financial shock. But housing and wages will not be enough if healthcare and social services remain weak. Alabama needs to heavily invest in mental health and addiction treatment centers, expand networks of mobile clinics to reach the homeless directly. A veteran with PTSD can only return to life with psychological therapy. A young person trapped in fentanyl addiction only has a chance to start again if given proper rehabilitation. Health, both physical and mental, must be considered the foundation of rebuilding. Education and employment are also keys to opening the door of reintegration. Vocational training programs, from mechanics and services to information technology, will give the unemployed a chance to stand firm in the new labor market. No one wants to forever rely on subsidies or sleep on the street. They need a hand to pull them back into society's rhythm. And when there is work and income, the cycle of homelessness is truly broken. Finally, the indispensable factor is the spirit of community cooperation. Alabama was once the cradle of the civil rights movement, where churches, nonprofits, and civil communities stood together to reclaim justice. Today, that spirit needs to be reignited. Churches can open their doors as shelters. Charities can provide basic services. Local businesses can create jobs for those re-entering society. When the entire community acts, change becomes not just a dream. The long-term solution for Alabama does not lie in a single policy. but in the combination of many pieces. Housing, economy, healthcare, education, community must be interwoven like a strong safety net, ready to lift anyone who falls. Because homelessness is not a disease of a group of different people, but a symptom of an unjust society. If Alabama dares to face the truth, dares to reform, and dares to place human dignity above short-term profit, the state can completely rewrite its story from a land of cold tents to a model of healing and rebuilding. The homelessness crisis in Alabama is not just soulless numbers on a statistical chart, but flesh and blood stories. It is the sound of coughing in the cold night, the dragging footsteps on damp sidewalks, the weary eyes peering through torn tarps. Every homeless person once had a home, a job, a family, a dream. They were not born to live on the streets. They were pushed there by circumstances, a storm, a job loss, a medical bill beyond reach. And with just a small misstep in life, any one of us could fall into that spiral. Alabama, a land once inscribed into history with the civil rights movement, now faces another test of social justice. If half a century ago, thousands marched to demand the right to sit in the same row of seats, then today the new challenge is the basic right to have a home. Alabama once again become a symbol not only of the fight for justice, but also of compassion and solidarity. The truth is, there is no simple solution. It cannot be just building a few shelters or handing out a few meals and calling the duty fulfilled. The solution must be a comprehensive strategy, from reforming housing laws, raising the minimum wage, expanding healthcare and mental health services, to creating employment opportunities and reintegration. And above all, it requires a change in perspective, from seeing the homeless as a burden to seeing them as people needing a helping hand to stand up again. Alabama is standing at a historical crossroads. If it chooses indifference, the state risks becoming the homeless hotspot of the South, where cities drown in tents and hardship. But if it bravely confronts and reforms, Alabama can become an example for the entire United States, proving that even in the hardest circumstances, a society can still restore dignity to its most vulnerable citizens. This is not only the responsibility of the government or major organizations. It is also a call to each of us. 1 hour volunteering at a shelter, a small donation, a voice supporting more humane policies, all can create change. Because, as history has proven, Alabama's great strides always began with the small but courageous actions of its community. And now, the question is sent to you. What solution, in your opinion, could help Alabama, and more broadly, the United States, escape the vicious cycle of homelessness? Share your thoughts below, because your voice is part of this necessary dialogue. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in these special reports where we delve into the hidden corners few dare to face, but which are truths that need to be heard. Because only when we acknowledge together, act together, can the light of hope shine upon the darkness of Alabama and of the entire world.